Welcome, friends. We're so glad to have you here. We've prepared some incredible stories that we hope you'll enjoy. If you do, and you'd like to support the channel and help it grow, please consider subscribing. Your support means the world to us. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a weekend away. I needed it. Work had been relentless, and my boss seemed to think vacation was a mythical creature. So when my friend Chris offered me his lakefront cabin for a few days, I jumped at the chance. It was quiet, remote, and completely off the grid, exactly what I needed. The cabin wasn't much to look at, a single-story structure with faded wooden siding, nestled in a dense forest that hugged the shores of Blackwood Lake. The air was crisp, the kind that smells like pine and earth. I could almost feel my stress evaporate as I parked my car and stepped out. Chris had warned me the place was rustic, which was his way of saying no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and a finicky old generator. Fine by me. I wanted peace, and a lack of connection meant no interruptions. The first day passed in a blissful haze. I grilled some burgers on the old charcoal grill, sipped on a few beers, and read half a novel while listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. By sunset, the sky was a watercolor masterpiece, and I couldn't remember the last time I felt this relaxed. Then the night came. It started small, a nagging unease I couldn't quite place. The kind you feel when you realize you left the front door unlocked or forgot to turn off the stove. The cabin had a creaky charm during the day, but in the dark, every groan of the timber and whisper of the wind felt different. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The generator had died hours earlier, leaving the cabin shrouded in darkness. My flashlight cast long shadows on the walls, but it did little to ease the knot in my stomach. Something felt off, but I told myself it was just nerves. It was probably the isolation playing tricks on me. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it. A soft crunch, like footsteps on gravel. My heart stopped. The cabin sat at the end of a long, unpaved driveway surrounded by woods. No one should be here. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? A deer? Maybe? But then I heard a low murmur. Voices. Plural. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight from the bedside table. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to move quietly, creeping toward the living room window. I peeked through the curtain, careful not to make a sound. Two figures were standing by my car. The moonlight illuminated them just enough for me to see they weren't hikers or campers. One of them had a crowbar slung over his shoulder. The other held something I couldn't make out, but it gleamed faintly in the dim light. A knife? My first instinct was to call the police, but my phone was useless out here. I was completely on my own. They started walking toward the cabin. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. My mind raced through options. Running wasn't one of them. I'd never make it to the main road without them catching me. Hiding felt equally pointless. The cabin was too small, and if they were determined, they'd find me. I needed to defend myself. I locked the front door as quietly as I could and shoved a heavy wooden chair under the handle. The back door, I remembered, had a flimsy lock. It wouldn't hold if they decided to force it. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. The Maglite was hefty, but it wouldn't do much against two armed men. Then I spotted the fire poker by the hearth. It wasn't ideal, but it was solid iron and had a decent weight to it. I grabbed it and moved toward the kitchen, where I had a view of both doors. The first thud came moments later. They were testing the front door, probably trying to figure out if anyone was inside. My breath hitched as I heard one of them say, "It's locked. Check the back." Footsteps crunched around the side of the cabin. My grip on the fire poker tightened as I moved toward the back door, positioning myself in the shadows. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. The back door rattled violently. "This one's weak," one of them said, his voice muffled. Then came a loud crack as the lock gave way. The door swung open, and a man stepped inside, silhouetted against the moonlight. He was tall and broad, his face obscured by a ski mask. He held a knife in one hand, its blade catching the faint glow of the moon. I waited until he was fully inside before I struck. The fire poker came down hard on his forearm, and he let out a guttural scream, dropping the knife. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I swung again, this time at his knee, and he crumpled to the floor, clutching his leg. The second man appeared in the doorway, his crowbar raised. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as the metal swung past my head. I stumbled but managed to regain my footing, raising the fire poker defensively. "Get out!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. He lunged at me, and we grappled, the crowbar scraping against the poker with a harsh, metallic shriek. He was stronger than me, and I could feel my grip slipping. Desperation kicked in, and I drove my knee into his gut. He staggered back, giving me just enough room to swing the poker at his shoulder. He dropped the crowbar with a grunt of pain. "Jake!" the man on the floor yelled. "We gotta go!" Jake hesitated, his eyes darting between me and his injured partner. Then he turned and bolted, leaving the other man behind. I stood there, chest heaving, as the adrenaline began to wear off. The man on the floor tried to crawl toward the back door, but I planted my foot on his chest, keeping him down. "Don't move," I growled, pressing the fire poker against his neck. For the next hour, I sat there, keeping him pinned while I waited for the first light of dawn. When it finally came, I tied him up with an extension cord I found in the kitchen and drove to the nearest town to call the police. They arrested him within the hour. I never got my peaceful weekend, but I did get something else, a newfound respect for silence and solitude. Sometimes it's not the darkness itself that's scary, but what it hides. And sometimes you have to fight to bring yourself back into the light. I didn't want to take the assignment. It wasn't because of the long hours or the solitary nature of the job. I was used to both. But something about the old hotel didn't sit right with me. It was just off. I was a freelance photographer, specializing in abandoned places. The forgotten and decaying were my bread and butter. Empty factories, crumbling mansions, train stations frozen in time. The Holloway Grand should have been perfect. A once luxurious, turn-of-the-century hotel that had been shuttered for decades. The tourism board wanted some atmospheric shots before they began restoration. Generous payday, a straightforward job. So why was I hesitating? Because I'd heard the stories. The Holloway Grand had a reputation. Strange deaths, vanished guests, staff who quit in the middle of their shifts, refusing to ever come back. But I told myself I didn't believe in that stuff. The place was just a dilapidated building, nothing more, and I'd be in and out before midnight. The drive out there was uneventful, the autumn sun hanging low in the sky as I wound through empty country roads. The hotel loomed on a hill, its grand silhouette casting long shadows over the surrounding forest. Up close, the building was a study in decay. Ivy climbing its brick facade, windows boarded up or shattered, and the once proud sign hanging crooked above the entrance. The front doors were unlocked, which made me uneasy. I'd been told the place was secured, but the padlock was missing, the chains lying discarded on the ground. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the doors open and stepping inside. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous lobby as I took in the grand staircase, its balustrade warped and splintered with age. Faded murals decorated the walls, their colors dulled by time and neglect. My camera felt like a reassuring weight around my neck. "Just take the pictures and get out," I muttered to myself. I started in the lobby, capturing the eerie beauty of the cracked marble floors and peeling wallpaper. The late afternoon light streamed through broken windows, creating dramatic shadows that would look incredible in the photos. But as the sun dipped lower, the hotel's atmosphere began to change. The silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind through broken glass made my pulse quicken. I moved upstairs to the guest rooms, using my flashlight to guide me through the darkened hallways. Each door I opened revealed more decay, moth-eaten curtains, broken furniture, mold creeping up the walls. I was adjusting my camera for a shot when I heard it, a faint sound like shuffling footsteps. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was probably an animal, I told myself, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But then it came again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. No response. My heartbeat quickened as I gripped my flashlight tighter. I swept the beam of light down the hall, the shadows shifting and dancing on the walls. Nothing. Just peeling wallpaper and rotting carpet. Shaking it off, I returned to my work, forcing myself to focus. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. By the time I reached the top floor, the sun had set completely, and the hotel was plunged into darkness. My flashlight created an almost suffocating tunnel of light as I explored the suites. One of them still had a bed, its tattered canopy swaying slightly in the draft. I took a few shots, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in my stomach. That's when I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, whispering. Faint, almost inaudible, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I backed toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could step into the hallway, I heard a loud crash from downstairs. Something, or someone, was in the hotel with me. My hands were shaking as I dug my phone out of my pocket. No signal. Of course, I cursed under my breath and debated my options. The sensible thing would have been to get in my car and drive to safety. But my equipment was downstairs, and the thought of leaving it behind felt like a failure. I crept down the stairs, my flashlight casting nervous beams across the crumbling walls. The crash had come from the kitchen. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on rusted hinges. I pushed it open with the toe of my boot, my flashlight illuminating the room. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the usual detritus, rusted appliances, broken tiles, and overturned chairs. But then I noticed the footprints. Fresh footprints. In the dust. A sudden noise behind me made me whip around. A man stood in the doorway, his face obscured by a ski mask. My stomach dropped. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Didn't think anyone would be here." I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "I'm leaving," I stammered. "I won't tell anyone you were here." He chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, I don't think you're going anywhere." Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed the nearest object, a rusted frying pan, and swung it at him. It connected with a sickening thud, and he stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait for him to recover. I bolted out of the kitchen, my heart hammering in my chest. Another man appeared at the base of the stairs, blocking my path to the exit. I turned and ran deeper into the hotel, my mind racing for a plan. I ducked into a storage room, slamming the door shut and wedging a chair under the handle. My flashlight was flickering, its battery on the verge of dying. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder. "You can't hide forever," one of them called out, his voice dripping with menace. I scanned the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on an old fire extinguisher. I grabbed it and positioned myself by the door, my heart pounding. The chair rattled as they tried to force the door open. With a loud crash, it gave way, and the first man stumbled in. I pulled the pin on the extinguisher and sprayed him in the face. He screamed, clawing at his eyes, and I swung the canister at his head, knocking him out cold. The second man was right behind him, but I didn't give him a chance. I hurled the extinguisher at him and bolted past, running for the exit. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I sped away from the Holloway Grand, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The hotel loomed in the distance, its dark windows watching me like empty eyes. I never went back to retrieve my equipment. Some things just aren't worth the risk. Sometimes the scariest thing in the dark isn't the supernatural. It's the people lurking in the shadows. The village of Weatherford sat at the edge of a sprawling moor, its cluster of stone cottages surrounded by fields and bordered by dense woods. I'd come for a month-long sabbatical, renting a cottage on the outskirts to focus on writing. It was the perfect spot for solitude, quiet, quaint, and removed from the bustle of city life. Most of the villagers were polite, though reserved. They greeted me with nods and soft smiles, but didn't linger for conversation, except for old Eli. Eli lived in a small, ramshackle house near the village square, his thick glasses perpetually smudged, and his hands always busy with some kind of repair work. He was a wiry man in his 70s, sharp-eyed and full of stories. The other villagers seemed to regard him with a mix of respect and exasperation, like he was a relic of a bygone era. "The woods around here aren't as empty as they look," he told me one day as we chatted by the market. "And this village, it's not as quiet as it seems." I laughed it off, assuming he was spinning tales to entertain himself. But 2 weeks later, I realized Eli wasn't just an eccentric old man. It was a Tuesday night, crisp and clear. I was sitting by the fire, typing away, when I heard it, a sharp, deliberate knock at the door. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. No one in the village had any reason to visit me, especially not at this hour. I approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out. No answer. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. The porch light illuminated only the empty yard beyond. I waited a few moments before opening the door a crack. The cool air rushed in, and with it came the faint scent of cigarettes. That's when I saw it. A cigarette butt, still smoldering on the ground. I shut the door quickly and locked it, my pulse quickening. The next morning, I went into the village to ask if anyone had been near my cottage the night before. Most people shrugged and dismissed my concerns as paranoia. But when I mentioned it to Eli, his expression darkened. "You say someone knocked, but didn't show themselves?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. He leaned closer. "Listen, girl, this place might seem sleepy, but trouble passes through more often than you'd think. There's been talk of thieves, folks casing houses for an easy mark. Especially places like yours on the edge of the village. Keep your doors locked, and if anything strange happens again, you come straight to me." "Thieves?" I asked, uneasy. Eli nodded. "Or worse, some don't stop at stealing." I felt a chill run down my spine, but thanked him for the advice. That night, I triple-checked all the locks before settling in with my laptop. The woods outside my window seemed darker than usual, their silhouettes pressing in on the cottage like an uninvited presence. Around midnight, the knock came again. It was louder this time, more insistent. My stomach tightened as I crept to the window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. 2 men stood on the porch. Both wore dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by hoods. One of them leaned forward, peering into the window, while the other gestured toward the door. I froze, panic clawing at my chest. My phone sat on the table, useless with no signal out here. I thought about shouting for help, but the nearest house was too far away. Then I remembered Eli's words. "If anything strange happens again, you come straight to me." I slipped out the back door, keeping low as I ran toward the village. My breath clouded in the cold night air, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I heard the sound of glass shattering. They'd broken a window. Eli's house was dark when I arrived, but I pounded on the door until I heard shuffling inside. The door creaked open, and Eli squinted at me, his face stern. "They're at my cottage," I gasped. 2 men. They broke a window. Eli's eyes sharpened, and without a word, he disappeared into the house. When he returned, he was holding an old double-barrel shotgun. "Stay here," he said firmly, "and don't touch anything." I grabbed his arm. "Wait, you can't go alone." He shook me off with surprising strength. "I've dealt with men like this before. Stay put," and locked the door behind me. I watched from the window as Eli strode down the path toward my cottage, his gait steady despite his age. The shotgun rested casually on his shoulder, but there was nothing casual about his expression. When he reached the cottage, he didn't bother sneaking. He marched straight to the front door and called out, his voice cutting through the night. "Whoever's in there, you've got 10 seconds to come out before I start shooting." There was a tense silence. Then one of the men stepped into the doorway, hands raised. "We don't want trouble," he said. "We're just looking for a place to stay." Eli snorted. "Is that why you're breaking windows in the middle of the night? You've got 5 seconds now." The second man appeared, his face pale. Okay, we're leaving." They bolted past Eli, disappearing into the darkness. He didn't lower the shotgun until they were out of sight. When I returned to the cottage, Eli was already there, inspecting the broken window. "They won't come back," he said simply. I stared at him, still shaken. "What if they do?" He gave me a wry smile. "They won't. Men like that don't stick around once they know someone's watching." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He waved me off. "Next time, keep a good stick or bat by the door. You can't always count on someone else to save you." I stayed in Weatherford for another 2 weeks, but I never heard another knock on my door. The cottage felt less like a refuge after that. The isolation no longer comforting, but suffocating. When I left, I stopped by Eli's house to say goodbye. He didn't seem surprised. "City folks like you never stay long," he said with a grin. I smiled back, but I couldn't help wondering what would have happened if Eli hadn't been there. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes or badges. Sometimes they're just old men with steady hands and the courage to stand in the dark.